Not think that the quaint village of Nambukandra, nestled in the interior of Ra province in West Viti Levu, Fiji, would have survived the devastating impacts of tropical cyclone Winston in early 2016. In addition to the encroaching impacts of climate change, the cyclone destroyed a further 95% of the houses in Nambukandra village.
If we tuna korang na lagu makin na tinggi lampu na uwe rutin bagan wangga kena ni kena dia. Dan ni bukan serana lalu ko. Mungkin itu ke bali song kena ho.
The cyclone was really terrifying because it took away most of our livelihood. For example, the coconut trees. We used to sell lots of coconuts before, and due to the devastation of TC Winston, in fact, probably 95% of coconut trees were destroyed. Cyclones are now a nightmare to us. You know, like before Winston, we saw the signs.
In the aftermath of TC Winston, villagers considered makeshift shelters made of tarpaulins as an immediate need for their families. Through the guidance and assistance of non-government organizations, villagers began their first steps towards rebuilding.
We've basically changed everything, you know. Our house plant, this awareness wasn't there before the cyclone. We built just to have a home, a shelter, you know. But not anymore. That doesn't happen anymore.
Sa to singa na gusto ni right sa to stan singa na kumbrio. Yun na to singa ni na kuntan singa ni sana ngamun sana ni.
Asala ko ni yaw. Ibena mo no mo toki kinia. Ina mo wa. Ko ro mo se ko ro makau. Au sangai uno mo yaw. Na ika na dang ko ro makau. Kawa sur kinia. Ala se oki manane mamang kase na amay na uboy kay mama na amay kay man na inay kay man. Waya una ika nga bene mamu ko makao. Nerdo ba ika na ngaw na niko.
As they await the government's next step for relocation, the people of Nambukandra have come to a generational split. While the old are determined to choose ancestral pillars beside the sea, the young are slowly cutting ties to move piece by piece to higher ground. The decision of young people staying in Nambukandra is still an uncertain one.
Bula Vinaka, Happy New Year, everybody. My name is Nathaniel Lispe, and I serve as the project manager for the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center in the Pacific on behalf of the IOM and GIZ, the co-chairs of the Technical Working Group of Human Mobility. I'd like to welcome you all to today's sixth webinar series of PRP, and the second one on this very important issue on internal displacement. It is great to see familiar faces and names joining us again today to talk about this topic on internal displacement. And we also welcome those joining us for the first time and those joining from outside of the Pacific. And we look forward to your contribution in our conversation today. I will be joined later on in the agenda by Litiem Bukoto from the Pacific community, and we'll be your co-moderators for this series. The outcome of today's conversation will feed into the upcoming Pacific Regional Consultation on Internal Displacement that will be happening in February, and later on we'll get the update from the co-chairs of the TWG. This is something that we've been organizing with the UN Secretary Generals of established high-level panel on internal displacement secretariat. Today's webinar, Evidence to Impact, Addressing Data and Knowledge Gap on Internal Displacement in the Pacific, is a continuation of the conversation that we had back in December, which was focused on stories of resilience, recovery, and solution in the context of internal displacement. We did learn from the first webinar that about the reality and complexity of this issue, that is driven mostly by disaster and climate in the Pacific. We heard from the Solomon Islands, Fiji, Federated State of Micronesia, and also the Republic of the Marshall Islands. It spotlighted some profound local knowledge and customs to addressing the impacts of internal displacement. However, it also underscored the ongoing data challenges and the knowledge gaps hindering the capacity of countries to meaningfully monitor, measure, and also manage the risks and losses related to internal displacement associated with climate change and disasters. It's very important to know that data and knowledge is necessary for the development and the implementation of evidence-based policy and durable actions to prepare, prevent, and respond to this very important issue on internal displacement. We therefore today have a lineup of 3 speakers who will help us understand and unpack some of the gaps and issues, some of the challenges on internal displacement data and knowledge, and how some of their current work and research across the region is helping plug in these gaps. Following this, we hope to open the floor to you in the spirit of Talanoa, where we can learn from your experience, learn from each other on your experience to do with data and knowledge. But most importantly, what are some of the best practices that you have that is also contributing towards plugging in the gap on this very important issue, but also shifting the conversation from just collecting data for evidence, but more so how do we actually generate impacts and meet and address the need of those being internally displaced. Following this, we then hope to wrap up our discussion today with an update on the technical working group plans for the upcoming high-level regional consultation on internal displacement. As usual, before we begin, some housekeeping rules. We kindly request everyone to have their microphones on mute if they are not speaking, and please do raise hand in case you wish to comment or raise a question, and to unmute and take the floor. The chat box is there to should you have questions while speakers are presenting, but also if you think about a tool, link to a tool or any resource, please do also share it with us. This is important in terms of following up after this webinar. So I'll hand it over now to Litea for our webinar series and to introduce our speakers for today. Over to you, Litea.
We do really have a learned panel with us today to share their insights and experiences. Our first panelist that we have is Semiti Temo with the Pacific Delegation of the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. Now, Semiti is the Planning, Monitoring, Evaluation, and Reporting Manager at IFRC. Semiti will share some gaps and challenges on disaster displacement data and knowledge drawing from the Tropical Cyclone Harold and Yasa response. Naka.
Thank you, Litea and Nada, and Bulong Naka, everyone. First of all, I would just like to extend appreciation of our head of delegation, Ms. Catherine Clarkson, for giving us the opportunity to speak on this topic. I know that we have been part of this group for a while, and we are glad to be invited to speak on this topic today. I'll just start by, I know this is focused on internal migration and more so the Pacific, but the IFRC Pacific is part of a global IFRC and Red Cross network, and I wish to just start by explaining a little bit on the IFRC focus on migration and displacement. So recently, towards the end of last year, we released our Strategy 2030, which is basically a guide on our focus for the next 10 years from 2021 to 2030. And migration is one of the key focus. In fact, it was a key focus in our previous strategic plan, which was the Strategy 2020. But in 2030, we've gone into a more outcome approach as opposed to a sector approach. But what that means that areas such as shelter and health and WASH, which are kind of cross-cutting, becomes embedded into the different areas that we, different outcomes that we are trying to focus on in the next 30 years. But a few areas such as health, climate change, and migration remain to be focus areas in the new strategy. Now points to the fact that the IFRC considers migration as a key focus area in the next 10 years. That is due to the fact both that there is a great need to in the migration area, but also to the fact that we are probably a bit behind. So it's an area where our approach has been a bit ad hoc, and an area we think in the next 10 years that will be a particular focus on migration. So just to state that our approach and our focus over the next 10 years, it's kind of been a reflection of our work in the migration and the displacement space in the last 10 years, in the last decade. So we've had some very ambitious targets, and the main one for us in the Asia Pacific is that over the next 5 years, our target is to have 75% of all our national societies undertake a needs assessment and integrate migration and displacement into their strategic plans. For us in SUA, our SUA office, we look after 11 Pacific national societies, 8 in the south, and 3 national societies in the north. And it is, as I've said before, it's recognizing the need that we need to move away from a more ad hoc approach to a more structured, strategic, and principled approach. And it also, as I've said before, reflects the gaps and the challenges that exist globally, regionally, and also in the Pacific. But just bringing it to the Pacific, what I would like discussion to sort of focus more on. I noticed that on the agenda that was sent out, it says unpacking data and knowledge, gaps and challenges on disaster displacement. But I think based on our experience at FRC, it's sort of the other way around. It's unpacking knowledge and data, because I think it's been more the lack of knowledge first, and then that leads to the lack of data and the challenges that exist in the disaster displacement. So the focus, of course, for us is to first conduct needs assessment. So we need to know what the needs are. I think as a first step, we need to kind of agree on a definition of what we need to agree on a definition of what a displaced person is, or a displaced household is. And I think that kind of links into the areas of to the challenge of identifying displaced people. Now this, with the Red Cross, as you know, that we one of the first responders, and with the technical definition of internal migration or displacement as someone that moves from their home to another place as a result of a disaster. As I was reading through the documentation, I realized that there's only been very little on written or research on internal displacement in the Pacific. There were some cases of in Displacement, particularly from the most significantly affected areas, particularly core of people moving out of the island to other places in Fiji. There was a few cases in Vanuatu, and recently the previous year in the Embryo volcano, because the places that they were staying before were uninhabitable, so they cannot actually return to their to the dwelling places, to the places where they used to stay before the disaster. What it brings me to the challenge, I mean, is just where I think the real issue is in terms of the gaps and the challenges in identifying or reporting on displacement, or and this is just a reflection on the previous two cyclones, the major cyclones that has impacted the Pacific, TC Winston in Fiji and TC Harold in the Vanuatu in Fiji. And based on our lessons learned from our responses, one of the key issues has been that we don't have a clear definition of what a subset of what a displaced person is or what a displaced household is. And from our lessons learned, we've identified is that people tend to be identified as displaced if they're living in evacuation centers. And naturally, people after disasters, they tend to move back to their homes. They try to move back to their homes, or in cases, as we've seen recently with this Yasa, as most evacuation centers are used for schools or community halls, because people have to move back. But then, because there is no clear definition of who a displaced person is, they seem to get lost. And when we do follow up on our recovery phase of the operation, we realize that a lot of these people are still displaced within their communities, or what we can probably term temporary displaced. So there are people who are back in their homes, but they're still displaced because they're living in tents. They obviously still have, they tick all the boxes. They need a shelter. They still face challenges with water and sanitation. There's obviously PGI issues when you have all those issues. There's health issues. So the real challenge for us going forward is to kind of focus on identifying, and this is a term, identifying or defining displacement. So defining what a displaced household is, defining what a displaced person is, and so we can identify those people or households during the initial phase of the response and appropriately identify their needs and referrals. And I would just like to kind of bring up an example of how we have, in some of the other sectors which have been working in, for example, in health, in the recent Samoa measles response, and also with TC Winston and TC Harold, TC Yasa as well. There's been a significant need for psychological support, because people have lost their houses, and in some cases people have lost everything. They've lost their houses, they lost their dwelling places, their livelihoods. So there's always a need for psychological support. So what we've done is we've trained volunteers on what we call psychological first aid. So we get our partners from Australia and New Zealand to train our volunteers to be able to identify psychological needs, or attend to conduct psychological first aid on people obviously have psychological needs, psychosocial needs, and then have referrals to proper authorities or other partners like the Ministry of Health and other development partners and other humanitarian actors who focus on providing psychosocial support or psychological support after a disaster. So I think that's sort of something that's kind of missing in the disaster space, and for us just to kick off the discussion. And I think from our responses, lessons, the real need for us as partners is to kind of, first of all, define, have some clear definitions. And I think that's the knowledge. The knowledge is defining what a displaced person is, of course, contextualize it to the Pacific. And I say this because even us in IFRC, we have guidelines. We have we have global guidelines on what a displaced person is, but it's different. It's a different context, different scenarios, and of course it needs to be adapted to the Pacific, and that hasn't happened yet. And it is something that we are planning to focus on. And I think this is an opportunity with other partners to kind of work together to develop or to agree on what we term as displaced people or displaced households in the context of a disaster, or on the onset of a disaster, and then we can go on from there. I think there's a lot of challenges, and I don't have enough time to talk about it, but I think if I can just start the conversation off by saying that from our end, that's what we sort of identify as the most significant concern or need or challenge that we need to address going forward in terms of temporary displacement.
I mean, I think you've raised a number of really good points. And it actually is quite encouraging to see how IFRC have actually embedded this in the strategic plan of the organization. The need for grid definitions is definitely something that we've been talking quite a bit around, particularly in regards to data management. The fact that you're actually linking some of the actions that you're actually undertaking as an organization and with the Red Cross societies in trying to actually understand what the need is. So being able to preempt and to set up a process that allows you to actually track and then to target some of the support provided to those affected. So our next panelist is Joseph Fokuono, who's assistant professor at the University of Hawaii. Now, Joseph has undertaken research on customary land tenure, climate change, and natural disaster displacements and relocation. In addition to this, he's also undertaken research on urban land reform, constitutional and governance issues in the region, and will be sharing with us some of the challenges of data and knowledge on displacement research in the Pacific. Vinakavalevu Joe, over to you.
All right. Thanks for having me. Now, in terms of displacement, there are international frameworks that are, in place, like the guiding principles and the International Agency Standard Committee operational guidelines, as well as the Peninsula, principle on climate change displacement within states. And these international frameworks deal with, issues of prevention of displacement, protection during evacuation, and throughout displacement, and also durable solutions. And one of the challenges most countries in the Pacific face is translating these international standards and frameworks as part of their domestic policy and laws, and applying them following a rights-based approach. Most countries in the Pacific, they rely on disaster management plans to address the protection of internally displaced persons during evacuation and also displacement. And in most cases, these plans are neither specific or explicit in addressing and managing peculiar threats to land, livelihood, and also cultures created by climate change and disaster. So as a result, there is no direct and explicit guidance in law and policy at the domestic level in most Pacific Island countries that proactively address prevention of displacement and durable solutions. It seems there's more emphasis by many Pacific Island countries on disaster relief and recovery, and less attention is paid to the prevention of displacement and durable solutions. So in terms of preventing displacement or prevention of displacement, as I mentioned, there are international guidelines and frameworks that clearly stipulate that government agencies and other actors must respect their obligations under international law, including human rights and humanitarian law in all circumstances, so as to prevent and avoid conditions that might lead to displacement of persons. So this concept, which is part of international framework, refers to the efforts that government agencies and other actors must undertake before displacement happens. And based on research that I've been involved in the Pacific, it seems that there is no clear strategy developed by agencies or actors mandated to deal with disasters to prevent displacement. And also this in terms of addressing flooding and other related disasters such as cyclones, there's an issue in terms of data regarding the combination between hard and soft infrastructure. So there's a need to unpack the combination between hard and soft infrastructure. So so information about specific roles of different community members. How does this soft infrastructure look in terms of social organization? What are the roles of different people within, such as the police or community leaders or and other actors. The other aspect in terms of knowledge and data is the gendered nature of displacement in a particular topic, in a particular context. What are the kinds of approach that different actors take, to address specific circumstances of women, youths, girls, LGBTI persons, and based there's really not much data in terms of the gendered nature of displacement in particular contexts in the Pacific. The other aspect in terms of, based on the research that I've been involved in, is how different circumstances of displacement is addressed. Again, there seems to be not much data in terms of how different circumstances of displacement are addressed. The other, in terms of data and knowledge, also is the intersection of displacement and sustainable development goals, particularly in relation to addressing the root causes of displacement, as well as durable solutions to displacement. Which is often sort of connected to entrenched poverty and inequality. So that's to do with sort of unpacking, prevention of displacement. In terms of protection during displacement, there are, key international standards and guidelines, which, Pacific Island countries have sort of drawn on and accommodated as part of their domestic policy and also laws. And Pacific Island countries create institutional structures to address, issues concerning protection during displacement. So domestic frameworks cover areas like, responsibility of various actors at the national level, as well as at the provincial or the local level. And addressing things like evacuation, camp management, disaster risk reduction, and so forth. So while domestic, frameworks provide clear guidelines in terms of roles and responsibilities of relevant institutions and agencies at both the national and local level, one of the challenges in terms of responsibility is sort of coordination to address the protection and the needs of people that are needs of people that are displaced or internally displaced persons. And the other thing, based on research that I've been involved in, is the implementation of legal and policy frameworks for the protection of internally displaced persons during displacement appears to put more emphasis on disaster relief than on specific needs or protection of people during displacement. So for example, in the case of the Solomons, in terms of when I was looking at some of the flooding that happened in 2014, the existing legal framework did not provide mechanisms for internal displaced persons to raise their complaints or concerns regarding how government agencies or other actors, address the issues of protection during displacement. And finally, the other aspect in terms of displacement is durable solutions. And it's one of the important aspects in terms of durable solutions is the consulting of internally displaced persons, prior to displacement and also during displacement and after displacement. So consultation with internally displaced persons in evacuation centers regarding their return to homes, new relocations or elsewhere. And relocation of internally displaced persons is usually part of government policy action. And there's not much, from the research that I've done, there's not much data in terms of how durable solutions are being captured you know, and there are a number of issues that that arise. So, you know, in terms of durable solutions, the international framework identifies, you know, key factors that affect whether any solution dealing with displacement is considered durable. So, you know, some of the factors are safety and security, adequate standard of living, access to livelihoods, restoration of housing, land and property, access to documentation, family reunion, and you know, participation in public affairs, access to effective remedies and justice. And based on the research that I've been doing is capturing some of these factors as part of the solutions to address displacement remains an ongoing challenge. So, you know, key issues usually have to do with, you know, standard of housing. Most cases it's inadequate. Issues of access to livelihood, usually also it's an ongoing challenge. And you know, restoring of housing, land, and property. Yeah, so those are sort of the, you know, things that in terms of data and knowledge, I guess it's important to explore as well as unpack, because in some of these areas there's really need for in terms of you know, data as well as knowledge. So thank you. I'll stop here.
For that, Joe. It's actually quite interesting, you know, in terms of some of the challenges the Pacific has had in translating international frameworks of any matter to the Pacific as well as to countries themselves. It was actually quite encouraging to hear about the need to have a human rights-based approach to being able to identify some of these durable solutions around preventing displacement. The point that you made around the need to have the need for coordination, particularly around displacement or human mobility. I think a number of partners who've dialed in today have had these discussions along with our counterparts in government. The point you made around involving displaced persons in the decision-making process, pardon me, to address their own protection as well as being able to identify their durable solutions. Probably something that's not a new concept, but quite encouraging to actually to be reminded of the need to pursue this. And often that we may tend to forget that those we're actually working with often can provide some of the solutions themselves. Our third panelist is Jessie Connell, the Chief of Mission for the International Organization for Migration in Vanuatu. Now, Jessie provided technical assistance to the government of Vanuatu in 2019 to help develop the national displacement policy, which she is now working with IOM on and partners to support government in its implementation. Now, Jessie is involved in the tropical cyclone Harold response in Vanuatu, and will share some insights about that today. Jessie.
Thank you, and Bunga Vanaka, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to participate today. I hope that you can hear me clearly. Just let me know if there's any problems. As introduced, my name is Jessie Connell, and I'm the Chief of Mission for the International Organization for Migration in Vanuatu. The story I will tell today is about our experiences here in supporting the government of Vanuatu to respond to data and knowledge gaps on displacement in an emergency context. Mostly, I'll be telling you the story, or about one story, one experience, of displacement data challenges during Tropical Cyclone Harold, a Category 5 cyclone which made landfall in Vanuatu on the 6th of April in 2020. Our experience of being one of many partners involved in the TC Harold response taught us lots of things, but among them, it was about, as the other speakers have said, the importance of having information about displaced populations as quickly as possible following a disaster. Who is displaced, where are they displaced, and what needs do they have? It also showed, again, like in other disasters, how difficult it is to get reliable data on this topic, especially given the remoteness of the locations where people are affected, and also in the context of COVID, which restricted mobility for TC Harold. But at the same time, our experience gave us a glimpse of what is possible and what might be possible in the future using some of the tools we have developed with government and other partners and drawing on local networks. So first, just a few initial comments about Vanuatu, as I'm sure many of you know. But Vanuatu, like other Pacific countries, experiences very frequent disasters: cyclones, flood, storms, drought, as well as volcanic eruptions, and slow onset processes such as sea level rise. In Vanuatu, there are around 100,000 people who live in close proximity to active volcanoes who could be displaced at any time. And this is one reason why Vanuatu has been ranked as the most at-risk country to disasters numerous times now by the World Risk Index. And the impacts of natural hazards are often exacerbated by human factors, such as through land conflicts and urbanisation. So all of these pressures, like we're hearing from lots of speakers today, make it even more important to be collecting good data on displacement about who is moving where do they come from, and what are their needs going forward. In the context of Tropical Cyclone Harold, Vanuatu had to deal with a compound disaster. When the rest of the world was grappling with the early stages of the pandemic, Vanuatu was one of the first countries to experience a major disaster at the same time as dealing with COVID-19. So while there were no recorded cases of COVID in Vanuatu when the cyclone hit, it was not really known whether COVID was circulating in the community. When the cyclone came, the international borders were closed and much of the country was under a temporary lockdown. The government had to make the difficult decision to ease the lockdown so that people could make their way to the evacuation centres. Now, COVID also made it very difficult to respond quickly after the disaster in the weeks that followed. But soon after the cyclone hit, there were many different estimates emerging about the extent of the damage, the number of people who were affected and displaced, and despite preparations, there was much debate about how best to get this information. Initial reports suggested that up to 80,000 people, or sometimes even more, had been displaced, over 27% of the population. And these estimates were mostly using information from wind speed and satellite imagery to estimate displacement. These very high estimates were useful right in the beginning, but they also demonstrated a need for a much more rigorous approach to identifying who was displaced and where across the country, especially as the weeks went on after the cyclone. So to try and fill this gap, the National Disaster Management Office, the NDMO, Department of Local Authorities, together with IOM, and also with the IDNC, the Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre, PDD, Platform on Disaster Displacement, and local partners, including ADRA, Vanuatu Christian Council, Oxfam, CARE, Red Cross, all worked together through the new displacement cluster that had formed to reformulate a methodology to conduct what is called displacement tracking, or sometimes it's called a displacement tracking matrix. And this was done with support from the European Union and the Central Emergency Relief Fund. IOM works in many countries to support governments to do displacement tracking, and it takes a different form in each place depending on the context, the type of disaster or conflict that is occurring. Displacement tracking has also been done in Vanuatu before, especially to support the Ambai volcanic eruption in 2018, which displaced over 11,000 people. However, for TC Harold, we had to quickly develop a new method that was adapted to the cyclone context, where there was even less time to prepare. So in establishing this displacement tracking, the NDMO and Department of Local Authorities drew on their network of local officials to share estimates on the number of individuals in each area council who were displaced in a consistent format. And to come back to the discussion about definitions of displacement, in this context, for this research, displacement was considered to be, a household was considered to be displaced if they were staying in an evacuation centre or with relatives or a host family because they were not able to return to their home or to their land. And evacuation centres included any public buildings, communal buildings. It also included other places that people sheltered during the cyclone, such as caves and other structures, churches in particular. So this methodology that was developed for displacement tracking in TC Harold enabled a series of revised estimates of displacement as the weeks went on. So 1 month after the cyclone, by the end of April, we were able to estimate that over 9,500 people were still displaced across 190 evacuation centres. 2 months after the cyclone in June, it was still estimated that over 6,000 people were displaced in both evacuation centres and with host families. And following a series of trainings, we managed to collect even more detailed data from hundreds of key informants and hundreds of households. There were some very interesting results that came through this research. For example, 46% of those displaced were under the age of 18 years. Households also reported perceptions of increased instances of child marriage or forced marriage in the aftermath of the disaster. And this is consistent with previous disasters, such as the Ambai displacement, and also with reports from the Gender and Protection Cluster for a number of years now. Displacement tracking also highlighted the ongoing needs around water, health, food and non-food distributions, even months after the cyclone. This data was provided to the other clusters and it was also used in the post-disaster needs assessment to estimate damage and loss. Displacement tracking for TC Harold showed us what it might be like possible, or what might be possible, especially next time when we have to deal with a similar situation. Especially if we're able to invest in these systems and structures that support good data collection at a local level. It showed us the importance of these local networks. And these are networks that, say, the IFRC, for example, have extensively through Vanuatu and through many countries in the Pacific. Other local focal points that are particularly important are the community disaster committees, the CDC focal points that exist in many communities in Vanuatu, but not all. And these focal points need to be supported and strengthened and trained in the downtime when there is no disaster so that they can be ready to rapidly report on displacement needs when disasters do come. But aspects of the Vanuatu government's decentralisation process are also critical to how easily we can collect data on displacement. In Vanuatu, for example, there is no single consolidated list of village names. And these kinds of things make it very difficult to report on who is displaced where quickly because of the risks of duplication and confusion. So we are continuing to address these challenges, especially with our partners IDMC and PDD, through a regional project funded by the EU called the Pacific Response to Disaster Displacement Project. And this is working closely not only with the government of Vanuatu, but also with the governments of Fiji, Marshall Islands, Solomon Islands and Tonga. And the eventual aim, among many aims, but it is to try and come to a situation where we can harmonise data collection methodologies and reporting at a regional level across the Pacific in response to disasters and displacement. And this will hopefully help Pacific governments and communities to be better able to shine a light on the impacts of disasters they are experiencing and be better able to tell stories of displacement that are taking place in their countries. Thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Jessie. It's quite, quite interesting, how you've adapted to being able to actually use secondary data in the first instance, and then while you're waiting to get better data from your local networks as well as local agencies. I noticed that you've also reiterated the need for coordination and collaboration to be able to do this. That there is no single agency that can do this on their own. You really do have to work together. The point that you made on informing recovery, we often don't think of displacement venturing beyond just the humanitarian period, and that's been quite evident in Vanuatu and also in some of the other Pacific Island countries where there's been this prolonged displacement in areas that have been affected. Then, I mean, I guess the last note that I made was actually working within the governance network, which is quite nice to see with the partners that you've been working with, along with not just the disaster management office, but also with the local Red Cross network. Nadai, should I hand over to you, and maybe if there are any questions from anyone on the call?
Yeah, thank you, Litya. There is a question from the floor. So I guess I'll direct this to Joseph. What are the international frameworks that we can try to translate to our context? That's the first question from the floor. So Joe, the floor is yours.
Okay, so I mean, there are a number of international frameworks. So 3 of the frameworks, one is, the guiding principles and the International Agency's Standing Committee operational guidelines on the protection of persons in situations of natural disaster. The other is, the 2013 Peninsula Principles on climate change displacement. And these frameworks, they sort of deal with issues concerning prevention of displacement, protection during evacuation and throughout displacement, and durable solutions.
Thank you, Joe. Also, there is I hope that responds to your question. So I'm sure that there's a different international framework that are out there that, depending on what countries have sort of ratified,
yeah,
or and they are obligated to sort of report on. And then there is so depending on which framework, then you can work towards how you can best contextualize it. But and then there's which is why it's I go back to the point of reiterating how important it is to have this data and knowledge, because not only are you contributing to that sort of localization, but also meeting your reporting obligations as well. The next question goes, it's actually on the role of private sector in plunging the gap on the data and knowledge on internal displacement. So I'll direct this question to perhaps IFRC, with all the experiences on your data collection and the vastness of the geographical location that you work with, reaching out to the most remote islands and communities. How do you see the role of private sector in terms of supporting your work, or even providing that support on data collection and even analysis, thinking about the Internet of Things and big data as well? So over to you, IFRC.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. It's a very good question. It is an area. When we collect data, is 2 things. One, we need to, as I was talking about, need to agree on what we need to collect, from who, and of course it's how we collect it. And for us at the Red Cross, we have been we're trying to because we are part of a global network, we have access to systems and processes that has been used in other countries, in other national societies, in other regions. So we have platforms, online platforms that we can use to collect information that has been developed, and we can just adapt that to suit our needs. But I think the more pressing need for us is actually, in terms of how the private sector can help, is in areas like, for example, particularly with the internet connection. As you would understand, after the disaster, there's significant damages to infrastructure, to telecommunications infrastructure. And being able to use mobile devices to conduct assessments, in that sense, it significantly decreases the time for information to be collated from all the different areas that are affected. But of course, one of the issues is having connectivity at this time. So we have systems where people can collect data offline and store it in their devices and then upload it when they get to areas where there's connection. But there's also the issue of having locations. So we're starting to try and encourage national societies to use GPS locations, so they can actually tag places. So it makes it easier to relocate those places, because with all the issues with naming and then even in Fiji we have same name, village names and all those sort of things. So those are some of the areas that we have. I mean, perhaps the private sector can help in terms of connectivity. I know that in the past we've seen they use devices that are the boosters, they call them the boosters. So in areas where there's a weak connection, they can use these boosters to perhaps get better connection. So there's also that, and there's also sharing of existing knowledge. For example, there are places that have their organizations in some government departments that have knowledge, that have existing information on places, on locations, on number of people, on population, which is more detailed and more recent than what's provided by the Bureau of Statistics in different countries. So those are the other useful information that can be useful both before and after disaster. Yeah.
So we don't have, I do have to apologize that we don't have much time to respond to all the questions that have been posted, and thank you so much for all those that have posted up questions. We'll definitely be responding to it after this call, and ask the speakers as well to reach out in response to the question that you've raised. We'll pick a couple of questions for now, and I have to apologize in advance that we won't be able to allow the speakers to respond to all the questions. So I'll go into a question raised by Coral on so this definition issue that the speakers have been sort of alluding to quite consistently through the deliberation has some sort of implications on the degree to which you can access different sources of finance, for example, climate finance. And I guess Joe, even Jessie can respond to this. Is this taken into account with the current global guidelines and frameworks? Perhaps Jessie, you might want to go first, or yeah, Joseph.
Thank you, Natha, and thank you, Coral. It's certainly not an easy question. I think that I mean there's been discussion for decades about ways to define displacement, relocation, forced migration, and people can get very tangled up in trying to distinguish these processes from one another. And I think that does have implications for how people may be able to access climate finance in the future, and now and in the future. I'm not quite sure about the exact scenario that you have in mind or the exact climate finance, but perhaps in relation to accessing financial support for planned relocation. That could be one scenario where it could come down to the definition of planned relocation, but also even more than that, come down to problems with identifying the cause of displacement or the cause or reason for planned relocation, and where climate finance is linked to a very narrow understanding of the impacts of climate change, rather than a kind of a multifaceted approach that it exacerbates other problems. That's where you could have exclusions, I think, that may otherwise need support. But I don't know if that really answers the question. Happy to have it clarified. Just before though, sorry, could I just add one thing on the private sector query? I thought that was an interesting question. I think that the role for the private sector in helping with data collection and communicating that data, helping to analyze it, is so huge and is only just starting for us. I mean, already as identified, telecommunications networks and internet access in these remote areas is incredibly important, and it's quite, even though you can save it to devices and upload later, in terms of getting real-time updates, we really need those networks in place. But even more than that, things like Kobo software, where you can easily input survey responses and see dashboards being produced in real time or very, very quickly, are very helpful. There's also other technology that's being used by Oxfam, unblocked, blockchain technology here in Vanuatu for their cash-based response to affected populations, and even that technology has some, there's some potential there for how we might be able to use it for tracking displaced populations in the future. I've also heard of discussions about using telecommunications data from people's mobile phones about where they are and where they've moved to track displacement. Although that is actually a bit more complicated and raises a lot of other questions that I won't go into detail about now. But yeah, just to add that to the.
Thanks, Jessie. Yeah, very, very interesting development, and I'm glad that a lot of countries are optimizing on those resources that are available to plug in the various gaps that they have in terms of effectively monitoring displacement and other and the risks and impacts associated with it. Lite, you might find this interesting. The question from Chale and also from Molin. Why is it, and I think it sort of relate to each other on why is it we're still talking about the lack of data now? Because I'm sure a lot of us are frustrated with even 2021, we're still talking about lack of data. So and I think the question really is pointing to that. So Molin asked the question of why we're still at this stage of talking about the lack of data, and Charlie also asked the question if there are regional stakeholder initiative to sort of address this issue of the lack of data. So I'll probably start with you with Semiti and also Jessie. You might also want to respond to that. And Lithia, of course, you can come in as well to if you have anything that SPC is looking into.
Okay, thank you. I think very quickly, I think the first question kind of answered the second one. Has there been work? I think the fact that there is lack of data, I don't think there is lack of data. There is available data because everyone collects their own data, all the different sectors, and we've heard IOM talk about secondary data. And a lot of us, when we had we conduct this information management exercise with our national societies, and we tell them, you realize that almost more than 50% of the data that you'll need for your response is external, is secondary data. So which points to the need for concerted effort to work towards having more common definitions of these terms, so that the different data that we collect can be useful to more partners. So I think the issue is not the lack of data, but it is the coming together of all these different partners to have some common definitions. It's not going to be, totally the same, or we're not going to agree on to the letter of it, but at least to a certain extent where it becomes useful across different partners. And I say this because I see in the Red Cross, we work across different sectors. We have shelter, in health, and from the medical perspective, I have seen this work in different sectors. But I say this obviously is an area which, if we're discussing this, an area that needs to be strengthened. Yeah. And if I can just answer correctly if I can just answer quickly the question 4 on temporary displaced. Yes, what I was referring to is that what we find is that people return from evacuation centers to their original homes, but they're still temporarily displaced in the sense that their home is still not fit for, they might still have water and sanitation needs. Some of them have tents next to their home, which is probably, as in terms of needs, is the same as in an evacuation center. So that can be in a period of 2 weeks to sometimes more months. So yeah, it's just it's probably a term that we use more often. It's not anything different from displacement, but just recognizing that people are sometimes, when they get off from evacuation centers, that sometimes turns out that they are not displaced because they're back at their homes. But even when they are at their homes and their original dwelling places, they still have the same needs as someone who's displaced. Yeah. So I hope that answers this question. Thank you.
Jessie, do you want to add to what Missy have just responded to?
Thank you. Just briefly. Yeah. So I also agree. I don't think we're at the stage of no data being the issue. And I think when you look over many decades, there's lots of data. In fact, too much information sometimes about different things. And that's kind of the problem when you're in, especially in an emergency context, you can be quite overwhelmed by information and supposedly by data, but actually it's not necessarily high quality data, and it's not necessarily what the information you need. And when there is a new disaster, I mean, it's if you're talking about using displacement data in a meaningful way to inform response, you do need new data very quickly, and it's it's very, very hard to get when we're talking about remote locations. So different types of data, once you become once you really get into data, you realize you could talk about it forever. But we don't have no data, but we don't have enough of the right type of data in a timely way, perhaps.
Thanks, Jessie. So we'll take on this last question, and before we wrap up. So from Bruce Burson, one of the challenges in terms of definitions will be getting a shared understanding of when displacement ends. Is this capable of being answered in absolute terms, or is it always context specific? Whatever the definition is, it should be anchored in the specific understandings of home, place, and belonging. Is a good starting point to identify what they are and work outwards from there into specific national context. I'll probably give this to either to Joe. You can quickly respond to that before we wrap up.
Yes. So yeah, this displacement is really a term that sort of describes the involuntary nature of movement. And, there are, in some cases, people experience an ongoing issue with displacement. So example, in the case of the Solomons, where you have informal settlements, or what's described as squatter settlements that are along riverbanks, they are always exposed to flooding. So they, in that context, their displacement will be a sort of an ongoing experience, unless if there are durable solutions that are framed in a way to address how these people should be moved to a different place, or address their housing and issues to do with infrastructure. So I guess it depends on the context when it comes to displacement. So displacement can be a one-off experience, or it can be an ongoing experience, depending on the context. And I think I agree with the comment saying that this should be understood in terms of home, place, and belonging, because in some context, this is where it's a space that people belong to, and that's where they have their history, identity. So when it comes to issues of a relocation because of displacement, it raises questions to do with, are you also moving people's livelihood, or and also addressing questions to do with how are you addressing issues to do with people's connection back to their place of origin, if you are moving people because of displacement. So these are conversations that need to be it's a conversation that are part of the sort of the durable solutions framework.
Excellent response, Joe. I guess, yeah, since Semiti started off this conversation on definition, perhaps you might want to share some thoughts on this as well. Semiti, if there's any.
Yeah, I think I don't really have anything more to say on definitions. I think from the FRC perspective, we've had it's always been, before we can actually think about having conversations with partners, because before we can start to talk about data needs and collecting information, we need to have a clear definition of what we are working on or what we are collecting. And I think that's just, it is the starting point. We need to have a clear and common definition of what displacement is in the specific context before we start to get on to the more other solid things that we need to work on. And I think, and this is also reflection from the other sectors that we work in. Defining things is always the first step into getting agreements on the more long-term, more permanent stuff. Sorry, Joe, was there anything else that I need to?
Yep. I mean, the other thing I should highlight is, most of the people that are, exposed to this issue of displacement are usually people that are not quite well off. And many of these people, live in informal settlements, or they live in places that are exposed to, all kinds of, natural disaster, and then even issues to do with climate change.
Yeah, thank you both for your for those again interesting insights on the issue around definitions and bringing clarity as well to the definition of those being displaced, and I guess different country contexts have a different way of even tagging it. As in my experience from the project that we're implementing, like people don't even want to talk about displacement in some countries, and there's different way of actually framing the issue itself, which would then determine the kind of data or the lack of within that particular country. So we've gone a bit over time with our series today, but I would like to thank you all once again for all those questions and comments that has been coming in within the chat box. And some we've responded to it, some we haven't. We'll definitely be getting back to all those that have raised the questions so that we can respond to your questions. And thank you also for those suggestions for the next webinar series, and also the different range of questions and response and remarks that's been shared as well. But special thank you also to the speakers today, Semiti Temo from IFRC, Jessie Connell from IOM in Vanuatu, and also to Joseph, my good friend in the University of Hawaii. Thank you for making time and contributing your insights to this very, again, another complex aspect of internal displacement. And I think, Semiti, you started off on point by saying that it's really the lack of knowledge that's leading to the lack of data that is in the Pacific. Before I actually close for today, I'd just like to give the floor now to the co-chair of the technical working group to give us a bit of an update on the regional consultation that's upcoming in Feb, and how all this conversation that we'll be having now will actually contribute to that. So Sabira, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Natha. And thank you very much to the speakers as well for another super interesting webinar. Maybe also just to publicize the previous webinar that happened, that's also already on the PRP webpage. So I guess just to, not to take any more time, but just to say that I think we mentioned this as well at the last webinar and during our technical working group meetings, that we are actually doing all of this work with the view of actually leading up to the high-level panel discussion that we will be having on internal displacement on the 11th of February. So on the 11th of February, it's an unfortunate time, I think, for the region. It's from 6 to 8 p.m. Fiji time. We will have a discussion with Pacific governments, and the idea is that we will have basically, I think as of now, we have 10 countries that have committed to speak, and they will come together and basically put forward, lessons learned, best practices, and make recommendations to the UN Secretary General's panel on internal displacement, with the view of making sure that we have the Pacific region's voice well reflected in these discussions. So yes, I guess this is just a request to save the date, and we hope to see you all at that discussion. And we will also be sharing, I think, more information through the PRP website and also through the mailing lists. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabira. So should you be interested to share more on your work and stories that is related to internal displacement beyond even the data and evidence, please feel free to do so. Or even if you have any feedback, do get in touch with us and the Secretariat as well. And we do look forward to be staying in touch, and also seeing you in February when we have the regional consultation. With that, have a great day ahead.